Hello everyone, it's Grandmama. Time for another story from our hometown scrapbook. Tonight's story, Fisherman's War. Hello there. Tonight's story is one told to me long ago about a little man with a big heart, a very stout heart. His name was Billy Bush, and he lived in Grays Harbor County for a good many years. When I knew him, he was a man of many jobs, living in Montesano and taking a great deal of pride in an engraved gold watch with a heavy linked chain that looked as if it had been worn for a good number of years. When the events of this story happened, Billy Bush was sheriff of Grays Harbor County. It was the late summer of 1888, and the harvest of fish that made Grays Harbor waters a mecca for fishermen was about to be taken. In those days, fishermen invaded the harbor from the Columbia and from even as far north as Canada and the Puget Sound area. They would run in their little boats, make their catches, selling to local buyers, then they would be off again to work in another area. Since the late 1870s, they had been working Grays Harbor from Columbia River ports, and each year saw more and more out-of-harbor fishing boats coming in for the salmon run. Well, when they came in for the run in 1888, the first things that they spotted along the shore of the harbor were fishing traps. Oh, there had been a few along the south shore of the harbor before, but this year there were many. They were operated by local men who found it easier to sit in the doorways of their little shake shacks and smoke their pipes while the fish got tangled in their traps, rather than to wrestle with nets and boats, even if the catches were greater and they could work the rivers in other localities. Now, there were no laws against fish traps. The Indians had used that method successfully to snare saltwater delicacies, and the white men followed suit. Some of the traps were elaborate and brought in bountiful harvests of fish when the runs were in progress. Others, just the bare essentials, but they totaled quite a bunch of strung along the edges of the harbor. Well, when the Sienners spotted the fish traps, they were hostile. Among the first days that they were in port, they ran their boats alongside one of the fish trap docks and threatened the trapper. But he ran them off with a rifle, and the Sienners withdrew to think it over. One night a rip-roaring fight broke out in the waterfront bar when some trappers and boat operators took off after each other over the subject of traps and nets. You see, the Sienners had enjoyed the good fishing on the harbor for so long, they thought it belonged to them by right of discovery, even though they didn't live here. They had fished here first, and they resented the increasing number of traps. And the trappers? Well, they lived here and called Grays Harbor home, and they felt that the Sienners were foreigners who invaded our harbor every so often to try to steal some of the fish that ran, and they resented the other fellows. It was just the stuff that a feud is made of, and that's what this was shaping up to be. After the fight in the barroom, there was plenty of bad blood between the two factions, and it was plain that there was going to be some trouble. But before we get into that part of the story, let's make room here for Dick Crombie and a word from our sponsor. Now, as I said, the stage was set for some trouble between the fish trappers and the Sienners, and it was just a matter of time before it would break out. And it started when some of the boats going down the harbor fired on the trappers along the south shore. You see, the boat owners had a sort of operating base near South Bay. It was a bunkhouse that they used when they were in port and wanted to get the water out from under them. It was filled with bunks and had some cooking provisions in it. It was known as Fisherman's Hall. Well, that night, there was a lot of tall talk about what the fishermen were going to do to the trappers. They began to organize their forces, and they And because they all gathered in the hall together several days each week, and most nights, they had time to talk. And talk. When a bunch of irate men got together, can quite often make a mountain out of a molehill. And that's what they did. After a few sessions of talking themselves into a state of war, they were in no condition to take a light view of it when one of the fish trappers fired back at the boats as they went past. He didn't hit anyone, but it made the Sieners think that there was open warfare. The trappers weren't organized. You can see how that might be. They didn't meet every so often in the same hall and talk things over. They hardly knew each other. They were just law-abiding fishermen who sat on their little docks in front of their little shanties and watched the fish get tangled in their traps. But when one of their members fired back at the Siena boaters, the net fishermen declared war on every fish trap operator. Well, you know how a shooting war starts. Someone pops off, and the other side takes a few pop shots. No one gets hurt at first. Then wham, someone gets hit, and things take a serious turn. And that's what happened. Fishing boat going downstream fired on some trappers and hit one of them, gave him a bad leg wound. And from that day on, the trappers began to organize, and they passed the word. If the fishing boat approaches, shoot to kill. So that afternoon, a fishing boat approached one of the trappers' installations, but the trapper was up harbor buying supplies. There was no telling what might have happened if he had been in his little shanty. But since he wasn't, the Siener landed at his dock, set fire to his cabin, wharf and trap, and sailed off. The word of that deed spread along the harbor beach like a prairie fire, and with it went the word for the fish trappers to meet that night. They met at a central spot for a council of war. Well, that night they did. The hard-handed men who had hacked their little clearings out of the brush and built their split-shake cabins and cedar pole docks, they met and talked in hard, straight terms. It must have been a little bit like the straight talk that took place the village square at Lexington a long time ago. But they must have had something like, if they want war, let's bring it to them. Each man had brought his gun and wanted to use it. They went straight from their meeting to Cal Point, for off Cal Point the Sieners were lying anchored for the night. The leader of the trappers deployed his men along the shore at various points, and when daylight came, the river mist lifted. There the fisher boats lay, rolling in the morning swells. The word had been passed that not a shot should be fired without a signal shot from the leader. So they lay quietly in their position until signs of life began to appear on the boat. Some of the Sieners had put out from a nearby beach and climbed over the rails of their crafts, while others who had stayed aboard began to start breakfast fires and shake out canvases. Then came the first shot, the single shot, and with it a roar of solid volley fired from into the boats of the fishing fleet. For a brief moment there was panic in the boats, then a single answer shot, then returning fire from the Sieners. The firefight didn't last long. The boats were showering splinters from the slugs, plowing into their sides, and some men on the boats had been hit. One by one, they upped anchor and scuttled off downstream. Well, it was a day before the news got up to the harbor to Hoquiam and Aberdeen. Some wounded were brought in for treatment, and the law was invoked when it became known that 2 of the men had been killed. A jury was called to hand down indictments on those who considered responsible, and the sheriff was told to organize a posse and deputize them. But it looked like a big job ahead for the law enforcers. The Sieners met at their hall, sent word up harbor that they would not answer to the sheriff without a struggle. In fact, they came right out and said they'd fight before they'd go to jail. But they were going to have to reckon with Billy Bush. When the jury had finished its work, there were 19 men wanted for the affair. Billy had signed up 10 deputies, sworn them in, and pinned badges on them. Then he strapped on his official shooting iron and started for Aberdeen. He took his posse down from Montesano on the Governor Newell, and the skipper of that little riverboat knew the temper of the warning fishermen. "You'll never take 'em alive," he told Billy. Each side accused the other, and both say they'll fight before they'll go to jail. But Billy Bush just twisted his wiry mustache and said, "We'll try mighty hard, Captain. We can't let them fool with the law." From Aberdeen, the posse went to South Bay on a chartered riverboat. It shoved its nose against the dock in front of the Fisherman's Hall, and the posse strode ashore behind Billy Bush. Their guns were loose in their holsters, and they walked straight to the open door of the hall, a big barn-like place with a cluster of men gathered around the door. Bill stopped at the door and, without raising his voice, asked for the head of the Fishermen's Union. The voice inside connected itself with that man, and he appeared at the entrance of the building, flanked by half a dozen other fishermen. "I'm the sheriff of Grace Harbor County," Billy said. Quite like, in fact, one of the fishermen said later, almost friendly. "I'm the sheriff of Grace Harbor County, and I'm going to read off some names. And as I read the names, I want those men to line up out here in front of the hall." Then Billy read the names, and not a man failed to take his place in the lineup. 3 men were missing and reported on their way to Astoria, but 16 of them lined up and followed Billy down to the boat and climbed aboard. Billy Bush had made good. He had called their bluff, taken their prisoners, and not one single fire was shot. He was not yet, though, but the hardest part was done. And now, before we use up all of our time, let's stop here for another word from our sponsor and Dick Crombie. Well, Billy Bush had done the hard part of his job. He had walked right into the enemy's camp and come out the top man. When he arrived in Aberdeen with his 16 prisoners, the citizens cheered the little sheriff and his posse and transferred the men to the Governor Newell for the trip up to Montesano. And when he came ashore at Montesano, he got more cheers. It was Billy Bush's day in Grace Harbor County, but it was also a problem day for that little sheriff. The county jail could handle nothing like 16 prisoners, so after considerable discussion with the commissioners and other county officials, Billy decided to take the men along to the Thurston County Jail in Olympia. Several wagons were hitched up, and members of the posse drove the loads of prisoners over the long, narrow, winding roads to the capital city. It was a long haul, and the prisoners became first surly and then very unruly. One man among them had been wounded, not badly enough, it was thought, to require medical attention. But as the miles went slowly by, the bumping of the wagon irritated his injury, and he moaned from his place on the mat of straw. Sheriff Bush overheard talk of making a break for it, and he played his trump card first. Billy Bush was crack shot with a pistol, so the old-timers will tell you that when he saw was the best in the county for his day. Anyhow, as the wagon rolled along, a native pheasant flew out of a bush and perched on a log about 30 feet from the road. Bush drew up on the reins and fired one shot from his heavy revolver. He shot the head off the bird. The talk of the break stopped abruptly. No one would dare go against that gun. And as they neared Olympia, Sheriff Bush loaded the wounded man into the smallest of the wagons, with 2 of his friends to support him, and with one of his deputies driving on the seat beside him, the sheriff raced for Olympia. But too late. The man died shortly after arriving at the hospital. Still, this consideration for one of their men won the admiration of the prisoners. Well, at the trial, the prisoners were found guilty, but the confusion of the many sides of the story won their release with small fines. Legislation barred fish traps, and in a few months, The harbor was completely at peace with the fisher folk. Oh yes, a group of Grays Harbor citizens started a fund to buy Billy Bush a gold watch and chain, engraved with an appreciation words from the county, and heading the list of contributors was the Fishermen's Union. And that's the tale for our hometown scrapbook for tonight. Thank you for listening.